good morning. We are half an hour from the opening bell, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. You're watching the China Show. I'm David Ingles, live here at the UBS Asian Investment Conference taking place here in Hong Kong.
And I'm Annabelle Droulers. Our top stories this morning. Asian stocks in the green after a US court deems President Trump's tariffs as illegal in a major setback to his economic agenda. The White House saying that they will appeal the ruling. Nvidia surging as well in late trading, driven by its upbeat revenue forecast. That's even as its China business suffers. We'll hear from CEO Jensen Huang. Meanwhile, China's semiconductor sector facing new restrictions from Washington as it tries its best to keep the tech out of Beijing's reach. And the US also taking aim at Chinese students, saying it will aggressively revoke visas, kicking them out of some of the world's top universities. Well, Dave, I think saying that it's been a busy news morning is sort of an understatement this morning, but you are seeing a lot of positivity across the screen. So just to recap some of the latest headlines, Trump's tariffs have been deemed illegal by a US trade court. The White House has already said that they're planning to appeal this decision, but we are seeing a market reaction off the back, and it's generally being seen as a risk-on move that we're seeing in markets today. You can see S&P 500 futures, for instance, 1.6%. in the green. So that is that story there. One of the top red, of course, of the morning will be talking about whether these tariffs are actually illegal and why they've been blocked by a US trade court. Is that decision as well likely to be upheld? Let's also take a look at what's happening across the session this morning, because it's not just the news around the tariffs, it's also Nvidia that's playing into the optimism today. So we had the earnings out. They're saying sales are going to be about $45 billion in the second quarter. That was pretty much in line with what analysts had been expecting. But importantly as well, that came with an $8 billion revenue shortfall from China. So we'll get the details on that ahead. Talking as well about rate decisions, because we just had the BOK breaking in the last few minutes. They have cut their key rate to 2.5%. That was in line with estimates. You're seeing here the Kospi gaining 1.3%, but also some moves in the Korean won, for instance. It is weaker against the dollar, although the dollar also gaining on the tariff announcements. Importantly, the BOK downgrading its 2025 GDP growth estimate to 0.8%. The projection had been 1.8% back in February. Taking a look at how this plays into the China session as well, the news around Nvidia, but also more importantly around Trump's tariffs, we are seeing futures here looking to gain alongside Asian equities a little bit higher today. And also just recapping as well, the top three stories that we're tracking this morning. It is around Trump's tariffs. It's also around the US move to revoke Chinese student visas. We'll dig into the details of that in a moment. And also, of course, Nvidia's CEO on the earnings, and also exactly what the restrictions to China around not being able to send the H20 chip, what does that also mean for their competitiveness on a global scale? But let's dig into these stories now, because the Trump administration saying it will appeal a US trade court ruling that his global tariffs are illegal. That decision, of course, blocking a key pillar of his economic agenda, at least for now. For more, let's bring in news desk editor Jill Deesis. So, Jill, what a morning.
What a morning. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that with this latest ruling, right, I mean, obviously the latest and all these twists and turns with this with these tariffs, in this particular case, so this was in response to a legal challenge against tariffs specifically that Trump enacted under emergency powers, his executive orders. So this doesn't apply to the steel, aluminum tariffs. Those were, sort of instituted under different things, but it does apply to those reciprocal tariffs that he put into effect. A lot of the elevated tariffs that you see on China, including some of the fentanyl tariffs that he's brought into effect, some of the tariffs that, he instituted on Canada and Mexico. So, yeah, I mean, essentially this court is saying that those tariffs are illegal. Now, I mean, for people unfamiliar with the U.S. legal system, I'm not a lawyer, but try to parse a little bit of it. The trade court where all of this unfolded, it's part of this broader federal system of courts in the United States. So the legal mechanism here that you're likely going to see, I mean, we already saw that the Trump administration is going to appeal that. So that's going to go to a federal appeals court. This is something that could potentially end up before the Supreme Court of the United States. It kind of seems like maybe that's, where this may be heading. But what this does mean in the interim is there's still a lot of confusion over what exactly happens here. I'm sure the Trump administration is going to try to get a stay so that they can continue collecting duties on the tariffs that are already in place at the border. But there's still a lot of confusion over whether they'll be able to do that. But yeah, I mean, certainly a pretty substantial setback for the Trump administration.
Yeah, and actually, Dave, just before you jump in there, I do want to say that the reaction from Bloomberg Intelligence, and they're saying that their thesis is that there's a 60% chance that the tariffs are going to be upheld if it does actually reach the Supreme Court. So, yeah, something to track very closely. But Dave, as well, about the student visas that we're also watching this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just a note on the Supreme Court point that you just made, right? It is, I guess, in many ways, Donald Trump's appointees. When you look at that court, I think that is worth pointing out as far as the probability is concerned when we get to that. Now, Jill, before we talk about the other top story on, Marco Rubio on X and that post, and I'm looking at that post here, revoking visas of Chinese students. This news actually came, I believe, before the breaking news on trade and that court. And, we did ask the question to Jensen Huang of Nvidia. They reported earnings. That's the other top story to get to as well. And, well, this is really what he had to say about that exercise taking place.
People from all over the world want to come to the United States. This is just such an extraordinary country with such incredible opportunities. We want the brightest to come here. We don't want others to, we don't want everybody to be able to come here, and there should be rules, but nonetheless, for the ones that really can make a contribution, want to make a difference, we want to make it possible for them to come here and bring their great ideas, bring their great intellect, and help us build a great America. And so I think the administration is all in on that, and I don't think anything that they've said changes that.
Okay, so Jill, the headline is already quite provoking, and if I was a parent, and if I had, of course, a kid studying in the U.S., I would immediately go, what are the details? How will this work practically, that the U.S. will begin revoking visas of Chinese students? What do we know exactly about how this will be implemented?
Yes, well, I think unfortunately for those parents, there's still a lot here that we have to actually see how exactly this would be implemented. So what Marco Rubio has said, I'll read his statement. He's saying the students affected would include those with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or studying in critical fields. You'd imagine that may have to do with, things such as advanced technology or such. But again, would have to wait for further details there. I mean, to me, this really kind of comes down to a lot of, national security concerns. We've seen these types of things voiced, by administrations prior as well. This idea of, students from another country coming in, is there a national security concern about their connections or what they're studying? Of course, you and I know that if you're looking into people with connections to the Chinese Communist Party, I mean, that's a pretty broad statement, particularly when it comes to China, where you've got all kinds of organizations that have various, sort of CCP connections and such. So, I mean, what a statement there. You have to imagine that, if you're sitting here, you've got the, Chinese students ultimately account for, I think, the largest percentage of, second most students of any country studying in the United States other than India. So it's right behind India there. So, that's a pretty enormous number of students. Now, exactly how that sort of plays out on an individual level, I think there's still a lot of questions that we need answered there.
Jill Deesister, our Bloomberg News Desk editor, maybe just a little bit of sort of inside baseball personal context when it came to this, right? So when I was a grad student, actually, in mainland China, during our internship with I won't get into the consulting company we were doing this assignment for. Back then, one of the very, very hot topics, which is why we were tasked to do this survey and study, was there was an enormous amount of demand from Chinese parents to send their kids abroad. And you had almost this industry that did everything from being able to tutor you, how to pass these entrance tests, the SATs, what have you, and taking you through the entire application process. And this was an industry that was booming. Like they had to keep demand, and they had to keep customers from lining up outside. And it's really indicative, Bill, of really when you go back 10, 15 years, the enormity of how many Chinese students are actually studying in the U.S. That might have reduced a little bit further, but yes, it is a topic of conversation there. We'll continue this in a moment, of course, and we'll have more on the trade discussions coming up later on the China Show. We'll be joined, in fact, here on set, Olivier Blanchard, the former IMF economic counselor, will be joining us to talk us through the trade conversations taking place. Bill.
Yeah, really great lineup of guests this morning, Dave, especially from the UBS conference, but also just taking a look at what's happening in the semiconductor space this morning, because you can see that Nvidia in after hours is rising nearly 5%, and we are seeing chip suppliers or semiconductor names that supply to Nvidia rising off the back. So we saw numbers that really from the results that sort of managed to soothe investor fears, because there had been a lot of concern about that China slowdown, how much of a write-down we were going to be seeing given that they can't sell the H20 chip there any longer. But we did get that solid sales forecast. And we also spoke to CEO Jensen Huang telling us about the AI computing market and what it could be poised for, which he's saying is exponential growth.
Well, we got a whole bunch of engines firing right now. The biggest one, of course, is the reasoning AI inference. The demand is just off the charts. You see the popularity of all these AI services now, ChatGPT, Gemini, so on and so forth, Grok. I mean, they're just doing incredibly well across the board. And all of the APIs that they serve out and all the agentic AI services that are built on top of them, they're all doing incredibly well. I think that there's just a giant breakthrough in AI's capability, and inferencing has just become a giant workload. Second, people realize that Blackwell is just a home run. NVLink 72 is a home run architecture. We designed it to be a thinking machine, a reasoning AI system. And I think people now, the confluence of the breakthrough in reasoning AI and the availability, now the emergence of Grace Blackwell, NVLink 72, perfect timing. I think that's at the core, a big part of it. And the second part of it is that our supply chain is growing and we're really ramping it up and they're doing fantastically for us. And so all of these things are all coming together.
And so it is fair to say that some of that additional supply on Blackwell and the demand for Blackwell kind of made up for the opportunity lost in China, at least in the outlook for this current period?
Yeah, I guess so. But, you can't underestimate the importance of the China market. This is the second largest AI market. This is the home of the world's largest population of AI researchers. And we want all of the world's AI researchers and all of the world's developers to be building on American stacks. And so, irrespective of the near-term revenue success that we have, we can't ignore the fact that the Chinese market is very important.
You explained, again, in some detail, that at least in the Hopper architecture, you have engineered down to the lowest spec possible. It's not possible to do anything different with Hopper for the Chinese market. But in your consideration for a different architecture or a chip for the Chinese market, is that what we're talking about, a new design or new class? And have you made that proposal to the administration, just designing from the ground up a new chip?
We're still thinking through that. They're just the limitations are quite stringent, quite limited, if you will. H20 is as far down as we could take a Hopper. We don't know how to make it even less, and so that's really the limit. So there aren't main, the limitations are quite stringent. So we have to really think through it. Whatever we make ultimately has to add value to the market.
That was the Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang speaking with our Bloomberg technology co-anchor Ed Ludlow and counting down to the open of trade in Shanghai, Shenzhen, Hong Kong. We're seeing futures pointing a little bit high, but there's some positivity given Trump's tariffs have been blocked by the US Trade Court. More ahead, you're watching The China Show.
Good morning. Welcome back. You're watching The China Show. David Ingles here, and we're live at the UBS Asian Investment Conference here at the Four Seasons in Hong Kong. Joining us here on set is the bank's co-head of Global Wealth Management, Asia Pacific, Amy Low. Good morning.
Good morning. morning, David. Thank you so much for coming over.
Well, thank you for giving us this very nice space. I know you guys are very busy. There's a ton of clients. I've seen a lot of them, family offices, what have you. So we spent time talking with my co-anchor, Annabelle, who's in the studio, a lot about the concerns out there, right? Everything from inflation in some parts of the world, markets doing well, not in others. There's trade. We don't know where we're going to end on that. So what seems to be the top two issues right now that seem to stand out from your clients?
I think right now the geopolitical conflict and also the trade war definitely are the hot topic among all the participants in this forum, as well as among our family offices. And if I may share a few takeaways from yesterday panel discussion, we have multiple panel discussion on the topic itself. I think number one is that uncertainty is the new norm. Especially, the whole set of disorganized kind of trade negotiation, where we don't know how the tariff protection will extend. So that's point number one. I think second takeaway I have from the different panel discussion is actually the data is quite strong still. So that's the reason why the kind of higher inflation, slowing kind of economic growth is not as bad as we thought, according to all the speakers. But obviously, I will still say we need to brace for the second half kind of data, right? And if you look at Nvidia, still have a rosy forecast for second half.
Yes, very.
That's very interesting. And then the third one is also renewable, revived kind of interest in Asia and also in China, particularly.
Okay. How would you describe risk appetite?
I mean, the fact that we had 3,500 participants coming here is over 20%, and more requests for investor one-on-one meeting. I think that's a positive sign. So meaning the appetite is here to also look at more investment out in the region and also diversifying across the globe, which is a good sign.
That they're looking for, they're looking at options. It's a good thing.
Looking for options.
I mean, diversification, I know we talk about that every year, but it seems to have a moment this year, diversification. So what does that mean in your world? Is it diversifying between assets outside of public markets? Like, what do people want?
I think it's both in terms of the different jurisdiction, because we just published the Global Family Office report, okay? And interestingly, in that Global Family Office report, 35% of the global family offices said they will increase the allocation to Asia, okay? That's point number one. And then interestingly, among the Asian clients and all the Asian family offices, they also want to increase the allocation. 50% of the family offices said they would like to increase the allocation to Asia. Okay. And yesterday, I also hosted a panel. It's the Middle East investment in Asia. Asia company going to Middle East. We have seen increasing interest. Interestingly, in that report, we have also 45% of the Middle East family offices saying they want to increase their allocation into China.
Okay.
And if you look at CATL, the IPO.
I think something happened there 2 weeks ago,
Yeah, and we are the co-book runner, and 500 million ticket, big ticket from the Kuwait Investment Authority.
Yeah, the institutional, the cornerstone investors is quite massive.
And also the BYD not too long ago. We also have a very big ticket from the Middle East family offices.
What seems to be missing is how are investors now looking at exposure to the U.S. market and the U.S. dollar?
I think obviously now, given all these geopolitical kind of conflict and also the trade war, the tariff, clients, our family offices are also looking for diversification into and doing hedging on their dollar, because among the Asian clients, dollar is a reference currency.
Yes.
So like almost 90%. So they are also looking hedging into yen, Swiss franc, Australian dollar, and euro. So that's one part. Another part of the currency diversification. And then the other part is also to different asset classes. Gold is still getting very popular.
Hedge funds?
And hedge fund, good that you mentioned hedge fund. Because according to, again, if I may refer to the Global Family Office report, 45% of the Asian family offices use hedge fund for diversification. And so alternative is still a very attractive asset class for the family offices to diversify their asset.
Final question for you. I think we're almost out of time. We had a story out about business class flights. So let me phrase the question to you this way. If I left Bloomberg and I joined your team at UBS and I had to go on a business trip to visit a client in mainland China, would you put me in economy or would you put me in business class?
David, what I can say is that we have seen really increasing travel activity out in the region and also globally.
Okay.
And we have also a lot of clients flying in and out to the AIC.
Okay. I only fly private. I'm kidding. No, I don't fly at all. Amy, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Amy Lowe there, of course, co-head of Global Wealth
you.
Management Asia Pacific here
Thank you.
at the UBS conference here in Hong Kong. She can't wait to even get out. It's okay. All right. I'll send it back to you in the studio.
Thank you.
All right, Dave. Well, I'm not sure that. Is it economy or business? Anyway, in terms of the market action today, you can see it's really being dominated by the trade news. We've actually just had futures, though, coming online, and we're seeing the Hang Seng looking like it's going to open pretty flat, so not sort of catching up with the mood in the rest of the markets. Particularly, we're seeing US futures, for instance, pointing to some big gains, and that's after Trump's tariffs were blocked, but then also the Trump administration saying they will appeal that decision by the trade court. You're also getting some lines there from the PBOC injecting 111.5 billion yuan into open market operations. Plus, you just earlier saw that yuan reference rate, but we'll have plenty more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back. You're watching the China Show. Just very quickly, a lot of things coming through these markets. Risk on. I think you had, of course, the big news out of EU's courts and Donald Trump's tariffs. There's the Nvidia story. So we're looking effectively at S&P futures really getting lift from those things as well. We did get an injection, I believe, again. When I say again, because we've seen it in recent days out of the PBOC. And effectively what we're seeing here is, well, I think authorities trying to manage liquidity on the 7-day repo to bring that closer to where we are in the benchmark. We'll unpack that story for you later on. Belle.
Yeah, great context there, Dave. And I think also what we're seeing in futures this morning for the Hang Seng actually looking to open fairly steady, so not really catching that mood that you're seeing in US futures there. But we are as well just getting some reaction to this court ruling from our Bloomberg Economics team, and they're saying that the decision really does add to already very high uncertainty. So we'll have more on that ahead. But you are watching the China Show this morning, and the open is next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching the China Show this morning, and we're counting down to the open of markets. We have got quite a few different headlines to be passing over this morning. So if you're just tuning in, I'll bring you up to speed on the top 3 ones that we're tracking. So firstly, President Trump's global tariffs have been deemed illegal. They've been blocked by US trade court as well. It's a major legal setback for the president, of course, who's been really testing the limits of his power over the course of this year. And so that is a decision very much in focus this morning. And we've seen US futures moving higher off the back, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to the point you were making, right, there's the earnings story. And there were a lot of questions, let's put it that way, going into the Nvidia earnings, which we've talked about earlier on. And, has the bar been set too low in that if they did announce something that was almost just incrementally better than the expectation, would that actually see the stock fall? And I think the guidance there, and perhaps also why we're seeing some upside on the NASDAQ more than the S&P, was really despite, and we'll tie this back to the tariff story, despite the exposure and despite the loss of business in the Chinese market, they were able to still impress the market. Yeah, Belle, go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the Nvidia effect is really playing across, and we can get into the market moves on that. But today as well, in the session, it's really around that Trump tariff story, but also the rising tensions between the US and China, because the other one that we're tracking as well is Marco Rubio saying that the US is going to begin revoking the visas of Chinese students. So that's how Chinese markets are coming on. You're seeing the CSI 300 just a little bit firmer. But let's take a look at what's happening in Hong Kong too today, because, again, we had seen futures indicating for a fairly flat start. You're seeing that again reflected so far as we open this morning, not seeing too much movement in either direction. So it points to just a level of uncertainty. What actually, when you take a look at the reaction from our Bloomberg Economics team, they're saying exactly this. The tariffs have been uncertain for the get-go, but now this ruling by the US Trade Court just adds another layer of complexity to the situation. Taking a look at how some of the Chinese software stocks or chip designer stocks are coming online this morning, because it's not just restrictions on semiconductors. Trump is now also expanding the curbs on Chinese semiconductor, the industry, by targeting design software firms as well. You're seeing these moving just a little bit higher, of course, could be beneficiaries if US technology is restricted. Taking a look at Chinese semiconductor names as well, again, those Nvidia numbers coming out. We also had the interview with Jensen Huang talking about what the plans are exactly for the Chinese market. They're saying that they're thinking about the different products that could be on offer, but no firm decision as yet. We just know it's not going to come from the Hopper series. You're seeing these a little bit mixed so far. But as we said, that Trump administration said to be moving to restrict the sale of Chinese chip design software firms. That's exports to China, of course. But let's get more with our China correspondent, Min Lo. So Min, what are the new rules around this, and exactly how is it going to be impacting China's chips industry as well?
Yeah, so the U.S. Commerce Department had sent letters to some of these big players that provide EDA, electronic design automation. And some of the big companies are Synopsys, Cadence, Siemens. And together, these three companies, they make up 80% of China's EDA market. So pretty significant impact, because these designers, while they make up a small portion of the overall semiconductors industry, but they are an upstream part of the supply chain. They affect the downstream manufacturers and the ability for these manufacturers to test and develop the next generation of chips. And they are being used in everything from the design of high-end processors for companies like Nvidia and Apple to even the smaller parts, like the parts that regulate power, for example. So China does have its own chip designers, but many of them do rely on these foreign software for the design of high-end chips. So a pretty significant development here. We saw some of these U.S. stocks falling by about 10% or so overnight. On the flip side, you see these Chinese chip designers, actually potential beneficiaries here, rising on the back of this news. But you look at what Nvidia's Jensen Huang has said and how they're responding to this escalatory regulatory regime from the U.S. They're trying to create alternative products for China, but the space is so limited that they're saying it's hard to create an alternative product there. And Jensen Huang has been one of those that had repeatedly said some of these chip curbs, they are not just, they're probably going to backfire if China moves on with or without U.S. technology.
Yeah, and actually Jensen Huang as well was asked in that interview on Bloomberg Technology about the impact of the restriction on Chinese students studying in the US, and he was saying that all sorts of people come to the US to study, and it's really an extraordinary country with incredible opportunities. So that was his take on the situation. But how have Chinese citizens been responding?
Yeah, I mean, this has, of course, taken social media by storm. A lot of people are just expressing shock that this is happening. Some people are expressing pity that, you know, they know of relatives who have kids who studied really hard or already got a place in a U.S. university. They're waiting for their visas, but now they have to think about whether to reapply to other universities or think about alternative plans. And a lot of comments on Chinese social media, if you pull up some of the comments there, some people are saying that Trump has offended many families, especially some of the elite families, the ones that have the ability to send their kids to the U.S. And another person saying that U.S. has unreasonably suspended some of these visas, and the cost of studying abroad has increased in the U.K. as well. And so one commentator is saying that students in Peking and Tsinghua universities, they should consider doing their postgraduate studies in China to directly serve the motherland in the future. And somebody else also saying that Trump is blindly walking into a dead end. He cannot believe how in our lifetime Trump is single-handedly, causing this decline of the U.S. empire and the idea of U.S. soft power declining here. I think it'll be interesting to keep a close eye on how the Chinese Foreign Ministry respond as well, because it's possible that China could look to retaliate in a tit-for-tat manner as well.
Okay, Min, thank you so much. Min Lo, our China correspondent, there with the latest on both the top stories we've been tracking today. We're also now getting reaction from our team at Bloomberg Economics really on this, right? And certainly, well, the question is, does this spell the end of that bid to reshape, that broader exercise to reshape the U.S. role in global trade? While part of it is obviously when, and Belle, let me bring you in here. You know, when the news came through that the court did rule it illegal, obviously that's favorable as far as does this go away, but it just simply, on another front, it simply adds another vector to what's already a very, very complicated equation that investors and companies need to juggle with, right? So fine, while we might get this favorably, if you think about it, on the side of of someone who's looking to send your goods, for example, it's something else. It wasn't on a lot of people's bingo cards. Let's put it that way, and simply adds to the uncertainty out there. And I think just to highlight the point, this time yesterday I was sitting right here with UBS's Wang Tao, who oversees, of course, coverage there for the bank for the Chinese economy in Asia. So I asked her, actually, are you seeing any signs of front-loading because we have this 90-day window? And she says there are signs of it, and the signs of it are not just in China. People are taking advantage of this via trade routes and proxies, Southeast Asia to the U.S., other EMs to the U.S., right? So you do understand how complicated it is to get these things to where they need to be by a certain period of time. And then you have this added complication to consider.
Yeah, it's very hard for businesses to be able to make investment decisions in this sort of environment. And I think as well, to your point around that front loading, it's also, and those workarounds. I mean, you think about the Nvidia numbers, for instance. We had the big hit from China, but the numbers pretty much came in line. And there's this possibility that the US is now opening up new markets, like the Middle East, for instance, even though there is that ever-present diversion risk, and do those chips end up in the hands of China anyway? But it's certainly playing into the economic story within China and the continued weakness we see in parts of the economy, particularly in the luxury sector. But some of the corporate stories that we're tracking this morning are exactly on that point, because LVMH, for instance, is one to be watching very closely. It's saying that its Chinese consumers have been pulling back on spending, which is a bad sign, of course, for the luxury sector. But first quarter revenue in the region, including China, fell 11% on an organic basis. That's similar to the drop it reported for all of 2024. The deputy CEO as well saying that Chinese tourists in the last 3 months have been travelling less, and when they do, they're not buying as much either. Bloomberg has learned that Shein is considering switching its planned IPO to Hong Kong from London. Sources say the company's weighing the move because the US, or UK rather, approval process has dragged on too long. No final decisions have been made. The about face would be a blow to London's IPO market while boosting Hong Kong fundraising that's already on track to be the best in years. We'll have plenty more ahead. This is Bloomberg. All right, let's go to one of our top stories this morning. The Trump administration saying it's going to be appealing a court ruling that's deemed the bulk of President Trump's global tariffs illegal. Judges in the U.S. Court of International Trade sided with Democratic-led states and a group of small businesses that had argued Trump had wrongfully invoked an emergency law to justify the levies. The decision is one of the biggest setbacks yet for Trump over a series of executive orders that test the limits of presidential powers, Dave.
Yeah, you know what? Let's start off with that, because we really have the perfect guest to help us understand the sort of complexities when it comes to negotiating a trade deal, how long it lasts, and really, as far as this is concerned, what the next steps might be for the White House in terms of this. And of course, we now understand that the Trump White House is appealing, of course, his tariff ruling. Our next guest is here with us at the Asian Investment Conference of UBS, is the author of the book, Why Politicians Lie. about trade. Joining us here on set is Dmitry Grozoubinski, Director of ExplainTrade. We're here with us. Good morning and nice to see you.
Good morning, lovely to be with you.
What a time to be having these conversations.
Absolutely. Trade policy used to happen slowly, now it happens all at once.
Yes, and it changes, and to your point, right? It could change by the end of this interview we're having right now.
God, I am fighting the urge to check Twitter as we speak to see if something has radically changed again.
On this new chapter that's emerged this morning, so we know they've appealed. Where do you think this goes next? And let's assume this goes not in favor of the White House.
Right, so we can assume that if the Federal Circuit rules against the Trump administration again, they have the Supreme Court to go to. But we've seen a trend of the Supreme Court being increasingly less deferential to the Trump administration. So there is, I think, a very reasonable chance that they uphold some or all of the Court of International Trade's ruling. Now, that leaves the Trump administration with some options if they continue to pursue tariffs. They have various old acts under the U.S. Code, such as Section 232, which they've been using extensively, but also something called Section 338, which allows them to raise tariffs of up to 50% on partners they find to be discriminating against U.S. commerce. So the Trump administration's toolbox won't be completely empty, but IEEPA, what was just ruled illegal, was such a sweeping and broad authority in their interpretation that it spiked the uncertainty through the roof. And if they comply with this ruling, that takes that toy out of the toy box.
For people trying to figure out, just black and white, are tariffs going to be in place, let's say in 6 months' time? More likely than not?
I think probably less likely today. I mean, if the tariffs are still in place 6 months from now, and by this I'm talking about the broad 10% tariffs on everybody, the Liberation Day tariffs, if they are still in place, that means the U.S. administration is not complying with direct, unequivocal court rulings, and that means we're in a far darker place that goes well above my pay grade.
It brings to mind also, at least this specific story, what the legal recourse is for, parties that are negotiating a trade deal, right? You used to be able to lodge a complaint, or still can, with the WTO. And I'm wondering, well, two questions there, does that legal recourse still exist in the event I don't want to negotiate with the U.S., number one? And number two is, if we do get a trade deal in place at some point, and there's a violation from either side, who do I complain to?
Fundamentally, there is no substitute for talking directly to the United States, and there really never was. The World Trade Organization, for example, where members can file a dispute, that can determine that what the U.S. is doing is contrary to international law, so contrary to what the U.S. said its obligations are, and it can allow a member to retaliate within the rules, but ultimately can't force the U.S. to comply, and members have been retaliating anyway. The World Trade Organization is only ever as strong as the conviction and fidelity of members to its rules, and the U.S. clearly isn't prioritizing that under this administration.
It's almost like, I think one of the analogies you do is it's almost like the players and the referee in a game.
Absolutely. If you are on a football pitch and you obey the referee's whistle if you want the game to go well. But ultimately, if you've decided you don't care about the rules anymore, the referee can blow the whistle as loud as he or she likes. They can't actually stop you from starting to kick your fellow players. And the U.S. has started kicking.
Right. Now, in the past, you've negotiated some of these trade deals as well. I also want to understand, we hear U.S. officials, Scott Bessent, for example, and some of the senior White House officials, they've said, we're negotiating with multiple parties simultaneously. I just wonder practically, how is that feasible for a team with finite resources? How easy is it to come up with a trade deal, and with multiple partners at that?
Well, let me put this in language I think will be really familiar to your audience. Yeah. Let's say you're negotiating a merger. There are basically two conversations happening at once. There is the big headline issues on which you really need the principals to come to an agreement, and there are the details, the stuff the lawyers wrangle over. Now, in most trade agreements, what makes them take a long time is that the principals don't agree on the big issues for quite some time. Okay. But if those principals reach an agreement, as happened, for example, in the UK and US agreement, then you can get a deal done quite quickly, including by pushing the detail down the track later and saying we're going to work this out. So how long does a trade deal take? It's a little bit of a piece of string question. The question is, can the US moderate its requests enough for the other side to be able to accept them and to be able to hand them over? And what are other countries willing to offer the US? That's really the key determinant here.
The fundamental ask, and let's take the U.S. and China, because those are the two big ones at the table, with fundamentally different ways at looking at how this relationship should be. 90 days, that clearly isn't enough time to hammer out the details of this, or are you optimistic?
No, I'm definitely not, and it's largely on the higher principles sort of question here. The Trump administration has been quite vague about what it actually wants from China. All of the complaints have been very, very high level about the concept of broad unfairness. If you were to try to nail them down, the US complaint has always been the fundamental nature of Chinese state capitalism, the role of the Chinese state in the market, and China is definitely not willing to change a model that it is fond of and feels is working quite well. So, if the US holds to that line, then 90 days, I don't think 900 days would be enough. Time would not be the magical ingredient. If the US is willing to accept something significantly more modest from China, like a decision to buy more US natural gas, then they could do a deal really, really quickly. It is all about the level of ambition of the two parties.
What else do you think is important? Where is your head at right now? What's at the end of this exercise?
I think it's important to sort of separate the chaos of today with the longer-term trends. There is clearly a trend away from predictability and investor certainty and towards more activist government interventions at the borders. So I think anybody watching who is making investment decisions or supply chain decisions needs to be asking themselves, how do I make sure that what I'm putting resources into remains agile in the face of a changing world? And secondly, how do I make sure that the complexities at the border, the really detailed stuff that can have billion-dollar implications, is filtering its way up from the people on the ground and in the trenches who have to fill out the forms, all the way through into my C-suite and into my government relations teams to make sure that I am not blindsided by what some of this stuff means to navigate in practice, because that's where so many of the landmines are.
It seems like an incredibly difficult and complex world to navigate. Thank you so much for the time. I think we're just getting started up here. Let's do this again soon.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much. Dmitry Grozoubinski, the director of ExplainTrade, but also the author of Why Politicians Lie About Trade.
Yeah, really perfect guess there, Dave. And just to mention as well, your lineup this morning, because you've also got Olivier Blanchard joining in about 10 minutes from now. And he's, of course, former IMF economic counsellor. But keeping with the economic outlook, because we had the BOK decision, of course, out earlier, lowering that key rate to 2.5%. It was very much anticipated by economists in our survey. But still, the other big story out of this was that they lowered their 2025 GDP estimate to 0.08%. It had been at 1.8% back in February. So it's a real reflection of how much Trump tariffs are wreaking potential havoc on the economy, which is very export-led. But the BOK talking about this, we do have the BOK presser starting in about half an hour from now, but they are saying that future growth is going to be subject to trade talks and also government stimulus steps that are taken as well. They're saying that they need to be cautious about FX volatility as well. So we'll get more of those details ahead, but you're watching The China Show, and this is Bloomberg. Some of the global headlines that we're following this morning, and Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has suffered a blow with the departure of two key cabinet members. The economy and resources ministers resigned after defeat in an internal party vote last week that's drawn claims of vote rigging and nepotism. The move may fuel concerns over the stability of Anwar's government and its ability to push through investor-friendly policies. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the country has killed the top commander of Hamas in Gaza, confirming earlier reports. Netanyahu told Parliament Mohammed Sinwar was among a group of senior leaders killed in a recent strike. Sinwar assumed the top combat role in Hamas after his brother was killed by Israeli troops or forces in October. He was considered a hardliner in ceasefire talks.
All right, very quickly, let's have a look at the shares of Hon Hai, and we're up about just under 3% here coming out of the company. We're getting some lines here out of the company talking about how, well, this looks to be forward guidance here. Hon Hai's sales, specific here, revenues here, are expected, they say, to top that figure, bottom of your screens. That is, of course, in Taiwan dollar, which is obviously on the stronger side compared to about a month back. So far, that's what we are hearing, Bell, so far from the chair, of course, Young Liu, speaking at a shareholder meeting as we speak. Bell.
Yeah, and of course, Hon Hai, a major supplier to Nvidia, and tracking how Asian chip makers are faring in the session today, because we had the results from the US tech giant and coming in really a bit rosier than had been anticipated. Yes, there's the big dent from China, but they've been able to fill that with new markets so far. For instance, we had the multi-billion-dollar accords being signed in the Middle East just a couple of weeks back. So you are seeing, again, these stocks pretty much in the upside. We are seeing Nvidia up nearly 5% in after hours today. Broadly, also taking a look at China, where we're nearly half an hour into the session so far, and you're seeing more green reflected across the screen here today. Hang Seng, for instance, rising now 0.5% to the upside. We did have Trump tariffs being blocked. The White House is planning to appeal that decision. We'll have the details ahead. Welcome back to the China Show. Taking a look at the Hang Seng half hour into the session today. So we've actually seen it trending fairly steady, I'd say. It's not such a big move that we're seeing in US equities so far that are really rallying off the back of Trump's trade policies being blocked. But of course, Dave, I mean, it's not just them being blocked. It's a level of uncertainty of exactly what happens next, because this is a ruling that could ultimately reach the Supreme Court. Taking a look at how markets are faring broadly in the session today, where you are seeing the biggest moves, as I said, is really what's happening in US futures, because the S&P 500, for instance, are gaining 1.6% today. You're as well seeing a firmer dollar. Tracking what's happening with Treasury yields there, you can see the 2-year, the 10-year, little change so far. We're also taking a look at what's happening in those more US allied markets. So the Nikkei, for instance, the Kospi, both gaining strongly today. They're quite sensitive to the moves on Wall Street as well. Taiwan there, you can see 0.6% to the upside. That Nvidia earnings very much playing into the picture too.
They are playing quite substantial, which I think is, you know, I'll put the two stories together on the Nvidia story, because certainly the bulk of the room going into these Nvidia earnings were wondering, well, was the bar, obviously the attention is to the company because it's such a consequential material company, but was the bar too low that even if they beat substantially, markets would react negatively? And it certainly hasn't panned out along those lines. And I think to one extent, markets are looking for pockets of trading opportunities in favor of risk. I think that the good thing about what we're seeing right now is every time, while the sort of trading environment remains very volatile, right? So I just had to look at average VIX, for example. I was just playing around here on my screen. So average VIX from January to right at about the first 1 or 2 days of May was below 20. The average from that point in time to where we are right now is still slightly above. So we talk about price, S&P 500, MSCI China, Nifty index in India have all completely recovered and then recovered even some more. But your underlying measures of volatility, liquidity are still challenged. So you're getting these pockets of opportunities like the Nvidia story, which is a very good example of that, are giving investors at least something to talk about. But then once we get the bad headline, things quickly snap back, which I think just underscores the need to diversify. And we haven't even talked about the rate story in Japan, for example, and this BOK decision, and they cut rates. And I wonder what they'll say today, Bell, in the press briefing, because they are very export and very open-oriented economy and market there.
Yeah, and I think you saw that playing out. I mean, the level of uncertainty into their decision today, because they cut that key rate to 2.5% as a buffer, given that negotiations between Seoul and Washington are still ongoing, and it is a very export-reliant economy. I think to your point, though, you were making there around the VIX and level of volatility, I think also just the level of uncertainty that's reflected today in trading volumes, because you're pretty far off your three-week moving average. But taking a look as well at the reaction we got from Bloomberg Economics, because they're also looking about this ruling rather from the trade court.
Yeah, they're saying that does this spell the end to Donald Trump's objective of trying to rejig the global trade system, and I think it simply opens up again. I hate we keep coming back to it. The level of uncertainty out there. That's not a cop out. We did hear that. We've had 4 guests so far here from the UBS Asian Investment Conference that have underscored the point that you're seeing from Changshu on the screens. The number of times they have mentioned, because they have heard it also a number of times from the clients they meet here on the ground, uncertainty. I haven't seen that level of cadence and frequency. And I guess it goes back to the point that this simply opens up another component to consider when you look at investors trying to figure out and trying to get used to life being not that simple. Anyway, let's put this all together from a rates perspective, because we have central bank decisions. We have, of course, the Fed's preferred gauge of inflation coming through, inflation expectations there as well. Garfield Reynolds joins us right now, who leads our MLive coverage in the region. Garfield, among the many stories that Bell and I just outlined there, what do you think we should be talking about right now? What are you guys zeroed in on at this point in time in the trading session?
Well, I mean, the obvious thing to zero in on is the question of what this court ruling means and how right those equity investors are who are trading are to be bidding up stocks, following the ruling that most of Trump's tariffs are illegal and should be immediately voided. The difficulty in general, I think, for equities and other markets in pricing the long-term and even medium-term impact from Trump's trade policies is that, much like the president themselves, investors have tended to regard tariffs as something that switch on, switch off. So when President Trump says 50% tariffs on EU are coming, and then he says, "Oh, I had a call. No, they're not, or at least they're delayed," then you see stocks fall on one thing and then come straight back up on the other. But for real-world businesses, this is so both things are bad. Like if you had a more reasoned, gradual rollout of tariffs where you could rely on where these levies are going to be in 6 months, a year, 2 years' time, that makes it much, much easier to plan than a situation where, well, they were this, now they're this, now they're this, now they're illegal, but they're going to be appealed. So those uncertainties are going to have an impact, and I think as Changshu was highlighting, the uncertainty levels are only going to go higher following this ruling. Be that as it may, markets are sort of accepting the idea that it's too difficult to price in those uncertainties now. What they are doing is saying, well, Trump's plans to use tariffs as a weapon in the trade war have taken a serious hit. So we're going to decide that means that tariffs will do less damage than we had been concerned about. And there is the chance that that is what ends up happening. I'm not saying you can't guarantee you can guarantee that won't be the case any more than you can guarantee that that it won't be the case that things will get much worse. They're just taking what's in front of them and going, this is a win.
It is. And you know what we haven't really talked about? I think you brought up a very good point there, Garfield. You know what the offset is? Lower rates. And central banks are cutting rates, with the exception of the Fed. And we have to wait for them. But yes, I think that is somewhat of an antidote, really, to all the uncertainty out there. Garfield Reynolds there with us on all the latest on the macro front. Now, back on the other story that we touched on here, and the big story across Chinese student visas, we did hear, and we put that question, in fact, to Jensen Huang out of Nvidia, who joined us earlier on shows here to talk us through their earnings and his reaction, really, to that news on restrictions and applications for students from the mainland and here in Hong Kong.
You know, people from all over the world want to come to the United States. This is just such an extraordinary country with such incredible opportunities. We want the brightest to come here. We don't want others to, we don't want everybody to be able to come here, and there should be rules. But nonetheless, for the ones that really can make a contribution, want to make a difference, we want to make it possible for them to come here and bring their great ideas, bring their great intellect, and help us build a great America. And so I think the administration is all in on that, and I don't think anything that they've said changes that.
Well, let's get more on the impact of this, or the potential impact, with Weini Gu, founder and CEO of the ZOOMiN Academy, which has about 100 students enrolled in its programs, helping them pursue higher education abroad. So thanks very much for your time this morning. And what's your initial reaction? Because, of course, this has been an issue that's really been flaring up over the past several weeks. But this morning's announcement from Marco Rubio on X just takes it another step further.
Right. I mean, this has been going on for a long while. A lot of our clients has been showing their concerns. A lot of Chinese parents have been very unsettled when it comes to their children's visa application to the United States. So this morning, and everything just happened, and we sent out the news, and I would say, I mean, people are started to getting used to this sort of visa news for the last 1 month.
And how does it impact you as a business? I mean, obviously you're advising students on applications to the US. What's sort of the alternative for you?
Yes. A lot of our colleagues, our peers in the industry, we're talking to each other for the last couple of weeks, and we're joking that whether we should find a new job and stuff like that. I mean, obviously, it's sinking in, and it doesn't happen just within one day. And a lot of our clients, we have advised them to apply to multiple destinations other than United States or any other English-speaking countries, including UK, Singapore, and also other places like Hong Kong, and we've been seeing this trend. A lot of Chinese families, they are putting their kids to UK or Singapore or Hong Kong, and they've been avoiding this risk because of the Sino and US relationships.
What about the students that you've worked with that are studying right now? Have you reached out to any of them? Do you know what their reaction is this morning?
Yes, that's a good question. I actually just have a couple of calls with my students in the United States, as well as the students who plan to go to the United States. So one of them was so lucky that he just got his visa issued this morning, and then he's so happy about that. Another who's planning to apply for stage management theater this year, and she was telling me, Whitney, whether we're going to have a really difficult and tough time to go to the United States. I was like, okay, it's okay. Let's just wait and see. And then I got a student who is now studying in the University of in Northwestern University. He's like, oh, Whitney, it's just been so chaotic. How is it going to coming along? So the students, most of our students are between 17 all the way to 22. So they're in this period. I don't know. I mean, a lot of uncertainties coming along.
I imagine for students and for their families that are making major financial commitments, because US universities are so expensive, for students that are already studying there right now and have this level of uncertainty, they don't know exactly what the next steps are. You have to think, of course, that there's a lot of reputational damage and a lot of uncertainty regardless of what happens next, even if these Chinese students can stay in the US. Do you think that the appeal of the US as a destination for students from China is going to be permanently dented?
I would not use the word permanently. Me, myself, have been receiving my education master's degree in Columbia's journalism school, and I've been a beneficiary of my education in the United States ever since then. So I've I've been more than appreciative for what I've been seeing and taking from my U.S. education experience, and that's one of my major motives in doing my business for this time, for my current business. And I've been helping so many, middle-class Chinese family kids to go to the United States. So using the word permanently would be too cruel. And I believe that in education, we are working towards, a better future. And how is it possible that a generation of new kids looking for better educational opportunities, and this gate would be hardened or would be closed forever? I don't really think so. But then for what's going on right now, there must be a lot of concerns and a lot of uncertainties. Yeah, and I would still believe in the exchange of ideas and the benefits of international students going to the United States. And I was just having this call with a friend at Columbia this morning, and then saying that Columbia Journalism School they are having an immersion meeting right now because half of the students are from international countries, including China. 20-30 students Chinese students are going to the journalism school in learning about storytelling skills. So imagine if all the things are stopping, and what will happen. So yeah, I just don't know how to put it into words.
All right, Weini, thanks so much for your time this morning. That was Weini Gu there, founder and CEO of the ZOOMiN Academy, and we'll have plenty more ahead on the China Show. This is Bloomberg. Well, it's been a very, very busy morning today, really very much referencing or reflecting, of course, the markets, Trump's tariffs that have been blocked by the US Trade Court. Also really getting a lot of reaction to that. Not only is the White House planning to appeal this decision, we're also getting reaction, for instance, around Bloomberg intelligence team, Bloomberg Economics, about how it's going to affect the global economic outlook. So let's get more on that down. Dave, at the UBS Asian Investment Conference, here also in Hong Kong, but certainly it's if not the talking point of the day, it's at least in the top three, probably alongside Nvidia earnings as well.
No, we were just talking about that with my next guest who's coming through as well. We're trying to figure out, it's an additional challenge and complication, of course, to, in the process of, rebalancing global trade in the form, of course, that, Donald Trump wants to sort of formulate U.S. trade strategy moving forward. But so what happens now, right? And I think people are trying to figure it out. In fact, I see people on their phones right now, just looking at the news as well. There's a big screen. This is not a plug. There's a big screen right behind me. You don't see it in vision here. It has the feed of Bloomberg TV on it, and people are actually watching all this breaking news that we've been doing here all morning. In fact, let's get the sense right now from Olivier Blanchard, of course, here with us at set, IMF Economic Council, Director of Research. He's also Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute here, and joining us here on set. Good morning.
Good morning.
So we just talked about this a few seconds ago. Donald Trump has run into a legal challenge.
Right.
They've now appealed. What do you think happens next? And do you think we will see more of these challenges come about? And do you think it gets in his way?
I'm not a legal scholar, but it was clear that the so-called reciprocity tariffs, which was 10% across the board, doesn't have a national security justification, which is what he has used to actually put tariffs. So I think this one is probably in trouble. There's going to be legal steps, right? But I suspect that he will have to take this one off. He'll replace it by something. He will basically, I think, try to get tariffs against particular countries. We'll see how it goes. It's just one more level of uncertainty. If we thought there was a limit to uncertainty, I think we learned that the limit is being pushed, right? So I think uncertainty is really the dominant factor. It's going to constrain him to make different arguments, probably to get the approval of Congress. which he has not. And I think Congress will give it to him under some conditions.
Right.
Not many is my guess. And it will just go on and on and on.
Has it paralyzed, to some extent, economic activity?
Paralyzed is too strong, and you still consume. I still consume, but if you have a firm, and you're thinking about the next step, which is, am I going to put my plant in Mexico or Arizona, or in Vietnam or in China? Am I going to move to the U.S. if I'm a foreign firm, and I find myself against Mexican firms, there is no tariff anymore. So it seems to me that any firm which is directly involved is going to say, let's wait, just wait. It's not the end of the world if I wait 6 months and I see what happens, because otherwise I'm stuck for 10 years, 20 years. Right. And then it applies to all kinds of firms. And so I think there's going to be a big effect on investment, I think that's for sure. Then you get what we call the multiplier effect, which is if activity slows down and the consumers don't know where it's going, consumption. So, yeah, I think no question that we're not going to get the growth we would have gotten otherwise. It's more complicated than that. I mean, we can talk about various countries. I mean, in the US, you have the fiscal aspect. Now that looks like a fiscal expansion, as bad as it is for the long run.
Well, it looks like it's more spending.
It's more spending. So in general, we think of this as good in the short run because it increases demand if there is a need for it. Bad in the long run, which it is. This one is a bit of a strange beast, right? Because the money goes to the rich, basically, right? The tax cuts,
right.
And the rich don't spend much.
Well, what's your assessment of the U.S. economy? I mean, that sounds like a very simple question, and partly it is, and I just want to get your thoughts on if the U.S. economy if it is slowing, and we don't know, if it is slowing, why are interest rates going up?
Why interest rates going up? I think because of risk premium, because of the fiscal. So the fiscal has two effects, right? In the short run, it can push demand. I don't think it's going to do much of that because of the particular shape it has, but we're clearly on what's known as an unsustainable debt path, which is that if we do nothing, then there'll be more debt than we can ever afford, right? And I think the markets are starting to worry about this. So you're seeing the long end of the yield curve kind of go up, right? If I were an investor, I would worry about buying a 30-year maturity treasury because God knows what's going to happen. I would buy a 1 year because there's not much risk. I mean, even if I think that the policy is crazy, I'm going to get my money back in a year, right? But if I buy a 10-year, I start saying, things could happen. So in the utter fiscal irresponsibility of this administration is clearly what explains the higher rates.
Well, it seems
and you've seen the yield curve. It goes down and then up, which means people anticipate the slowdown, that the Fed will help a bit, but they're very worried about the long run.
Do you expect the global investor community to continue to de-risk and reduce their exposure to dollar assets for the various reasons that you've outlined?
I think that indeed, I mean, we've seen, we got a whiff of this a few weeks back when the bond market went the wrong way. But the issue at this point, and where do you go? This is a discussion I've had at this conference. What do you buy? You buy gold. So, being from Europe at this point, I think that Europe has potentially something to offer. So we're working on a project on Euro bonds, which would basically trying to create a market which would not be the size of a treasury market. It's much too big, but it's big enough that investors could go there. We'll get a safe asset, deep market, liquid market, right? If we can do this, then I think it will be attractive. But in general, I think the time where the only place to go was the treasury market is no longer there. I think he has broken something which is not going to be repairable.
That's an interesting point because one of the views that came up a few weeks ago, the conversations around reserve currency status implicitly gives the holder of that status almost a license to fiscally misbehave and not pay for it. And now I wonder everything that's going on. the alternatives now to the U.S. You see Europe and China talking. You see China talking to its other trading partners. Do you think all of these things, on aggregate, will put a lot of pressure on the White House and Donald Trump to step back and do a deal that might not be as beneficial to them as initially expected?
One can hope. You know, the fact that you and I can borrow at low rates relatively doesn't make us irresponsible. Right. So by
we don't have to
itself,
borrow in US dollar,
it's not the cause, but it makes it easier indeed. And I think if he sees that investors are reluctant to actually, continue to lend, he's going to think. Now, what is he going to do? I think on tariffs, he's probably going to do a bit, maybe a bit less than he would otherwise. On fiscal, is Congress going to basically turn around and do the right thing? I think it would take a substantial increase in long rates before this happens. One can hope. But I think we need more. I mean, you need a change of mind. It's just not, the interest rate is not going to do it by itself.
Well, does the Fed need to do it? As a final quick question for you. Does the Fed need to be able to be that backstop? Does it need to lower rates?
No, I don't think it should lower rates. I mean, if a recession comes, then clearly the Fed has a mandate to try to sustain activity. It should not lower rates in order to facilitate the financing of a deficit. That's very clear. Now, I suspect it's going to cut rates because I think we're going to see a slowdown. So I think what the markets are predicting, I think is about right. I mean, I think we'll see the decrease in rates.
Mr. Blanchard, thank you so much for taking the time. Olivier Blanchard there. Belle, I'll send it back to you in the studio.
Yeah, really great interview there. And of course, we're going to be getting more on this US court ruling against Trump's tariffs later today. We'll get the White House reaction to it. Trade advisor Peter Navarro is going to be joining surveillance at the times you can actually see coming up on your screen shortly. It's not just the story around Trump's tariffs. You're also getting how central banks are reacting to this now. And the Bank of Korea really standing out this morning for that very reason, because they cut the key rate to 2.5%. The presser is just ongoing right now. But essentially, the governor is saying that there is a chance of larger interest rate cuts in future. In fact, 4 of the 6 members are open to a rate cut in the next 3 months. The extent of the easing ahead is a little bit unclear, but the decision today to cut rates in the face of Trump's tariffs, uncertainty around the negotiations between Seoul and Washington was the driving factor of that decision, again, to reduce the key rate to 2.5%. More ahead. This is Bloomberg. It's 11:29 a.m. in Tokyo this morning. Japanese markets are just about to go into their lunch break, but they are one of the biggest gainers in the session so far today. You're seeing the Nikkei there, for instance, up nearly 1.7%. It really is the reaction we're getting to how investors are passing over Trump's trade policies that have been blocked by the U.S. Trade Court. The White House is saying that they will appeal this ruling, but it's certainly something that could end up reaching the U.S. Supreme Court. And our Bloomberg Economics team is saying that this just injects an extra level of uncertainty. Still, though, traders today seem relatively optimistic. So that is Japanese markets there. But also, we're watching those semiconductor names, Dave, really closely after Nvidia numbers.
Yeah, in fact, more on that set of results coming out of Nvidia, of course. And we did speak with the CEO, Jensen Huang, earlier on. Now, he talked about also competition from the likes of his Chinese peers and Chinese rivals, let's put it that way. He's described that as intensifying. He's also told us that, that's adding to the case for Nvidia to now be able, and this is a vision, of course, to be able to offer chips in the Chinese market so it doesn't fall behind in that competition.
The Chinese competitors have evolved and advanced greatly over the last year. Like everybody else, they're, doubling, quadrupling their capabilities every year, and the volume is increasing substantially. And remember, these are data center chips. They don't have to be small. They could be quite large. Without American technology, the availability of Chinese technology will fail the market. And so, whatever we offer has to at least be competitive and has to add value to the market.
Jensen, does Huawei have an AI accelerator or a GPU that is performant as H20 or is performant of other classes of GPU that you make?
Huawei's technology, based on our best understanding at the moment, and we have a lot of ground truth there, is probably comparable to an H200. And so they've been moving quite fast, and they've also offered this new system called Cloud Matrix that scales up to even a larger system than our latest generation Grace Blackwell. And so Huawei, as you know, is a formidable technology company, and they're not sitting still, and they look for ways to compete, and they're quite formidable.
With that in mind, you've kind of explained the landscape now, NVIDIA's ability to operate in China. I mean, you and I this year alone have already discussed the idea that there are 50% of the world's AI researchers in or from China. But are you having a sense of the vacuum created that those big names, I think about Tencent or Alibaba or Baidu, that were buyers of H20, that they've already pivoted and turned to the offering from Huawei because of the policy that is in place?
Yeah, they have no choice but to, one of the challenges of the changing regulations is the ability for markets to trust the Nvidia and ultimately American platforms. And so it's prudent, I think, for the Chinese customers to make sure that they develop their stack on Huawei, and because it's hard to rely on American technology at this point. And so that's one of the unfortunate parts of changing policies. But anyhow, I have every confidence that if able to compete, American companies will compete. This is to write off American technology companies is not smart. This is the home of some of the brightest computer scientists in the world. American companies are incredibly competitive. We just have to have the confidence to go compete. And if we have the confidence to compete, we will win.
That was the Nvidia CEO, Jensen Huang, speaking with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. And we're going to get more on the Nvidia numbers and the reaction in just a moment. But first, we do also need to mark some breaking news this morning because the BOK governor is speaking right now. It does follow that rate decision this morning where they cut the key rate to 2.5%. What's also being signaled, though, is the prospect for more cuts to come because the governor is saying that there's a chance of larger interest rate reductions in future. And he's also saying that the decision today was very much unanimous. So you're really seeing a big move here in the Kospi, rising 1.8%. You've also seen Korean won weakness against the greenback that's likewise been strengthening on Trump's tariffs being blocked. But that is the latest there from the BOK press, and we'll recap those headlines as they come to hand. But let's also take a look, as I said, it's the story around Nvidia's numbers, and we are seeing the chip maker names that are gaining today in Asia, not to the extent that we saw Nvidia in after hours, up around 5%, but we are still seeing a lot of positivity across the screen. Taking a look and a deeper dive now, of course, into these figures, and let's bring in the Futurum Group CEO, Daniel Newman, joining us this morning. So Daniel, let's just start with your broader takeaway to the results this morning.
NVIDIA did the job that the market needed it to do. The entire world was sort of watching right now because there's been a lot of consternation as to whether this AI build-out would continue, how much the tariffs are impacting overall sentiment in the market. Is there demand with the potential write-offs of $5.5 billion, and now it's only $4.5 billion? They saw that some of this content was able to be repurposed, but that also there was this meaningful demand across the NVIDIA portfolio in areas like automotive, in gaming, areas that haven't been spoken about as much over the past several quarters, to show that this company can grow. And while Jensen Huang did spend quite a bit of time talking about China, there's a lot of optimism with the Middle East and what went on with Humane, with the demand in the United States from companies like OpenAI and Microsoft. So optimism is there. The overall numbers looked very good. They did miss on the guide, but I think everyone had expected the impact of China to be there. But overall, I think the market's reacting well to this and, of course, to the news about the tariffs.
Yeah, and I think that plays into that story. The China risk wasn't quite as bad, but we saw, for instance, those new Middle East deals a couple of weeks ago, and so it tells you maybe, okay, Nvidia is going to be able to unlock new markets. What do you think, though, for the longer-term outlook for the business? Because Jensen Huang warned about losing competitiveness in the Chinese market. How much can that be offset over the longer term?
Well, we saw the commitments coming out of their time in the Middle East, 500 megawatt data centers, hundreds of thousands of potential Nvidia chips, and U.S. technology being diffused around the world. I think with the current administration, there's a very strong possibility that China does need to be written off for a period of time for American companies. And I think the challenge for Jensen Huang and Nvidia and its investors is that there is a more difficult juxtaposition than how it's sort of being described. Jensen talks about it in terms of diffusing U.S. technology, American technology in China, which there's a strong case to be made for that. Having said that, the idea that China isn't moving as fast as it can because they were being supplied a older technology Nvidia chip. I mean, in the same interview here on Bloomberg, Jensen talked about the fact that they have a chip that's at the H200 level. They're building their own software, they're building their own stack, and they're building connected scale-up technology that can compete with Blackwell. So it makes me wonder why they would actually want the H20 or a tuned-down chip at any scale if their national interest, if the interest of China is to lead in AI, which is a multi-decade economic race. It's an arms race. So I kind of find myself in this interesting conflicted position where I wonder, of course, China has a ton of AI research and researchers, and they're building some really interesting models, but is their technology as strong as we are hearing and seeing? And if so, why would they want old Nvidia technology? And of course, you could say it's the software, it's CUDA, but I think this China situation is going to be difficult. It's going to play out over time. But I think Nvidia is making the right move by making sure their technology ends up everywhere else.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm taking away is that you think that the China business for Nvidia could effectively go to zero if they're able to really build up their self-sufficiency and technology that's, of course, greater than what Nvidia can supply them. Do you think that risk has been fully appreciated in the stock just yet?
Well, first of all, there is technology that Nvidia creates, like in gaming and other sectors and segments, that can still be sent to China right now. But of course, the data center business, which everyone is so focused on, there is a very real chance that for a period of time during this current administration, that the doors are not opened up. And Jensen said himself, he's not sure that they can build a chip or an architecture that's good enough for this market, that the market's going to want, receive, and utilize, that is going to meet these export controls. So it's very complicated. And of course, at the same time, while in the United States, you have companies like OpenAI and X with Elon Musk talking about they can't get enough GPUs. So there's also a decision to be made by Huang and the NVIDIA team in terms of where do they want to scale capacity? Do they want to build more Blackwells as they move to the 300 series, which should be another growth for the company? And then, of course, Rubin Ultra comes in 26 and 27. And there is a ton of demand for the whole portfolio. So they have to make some really critical decisions right now about, are they going to build for China? It's a huge market, $50 billion TAM is what they were estimating for their technology. But at the same time, if that market's not available, they have to pivot. And the great thing about this week's earnings, the results that we saw today, was that there's clearly bigger demand in all the other markets, because while they had to take that multi-billion-dollar write-off this quarter, they were still able to beat revenue. They were still able to deliver earnings. Their margins were, of course, impacted by about 10 points, but had they not had to write that down, they actually beat margin expectations, which shows the ramp was going better than they had expected in terms of profitability.
That was the Futurum Group CEO, Daniel Newman there. Thanks very much for your time this evening. And subscribers can also watch us live and see our past interviews on our interactive TV function, TV Go. You can also dive into any of the securities or Bloomberg functions that we talk about, plus become part of the conversation by sending us instant messages. Check it out at TV Go. We'll have plenty more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back. You're watching The China Show. We're coming to you live, of course, out of the UBS Asian Investment Conference. And you could almost guess without having tuned in what the topic of the day was. And let me just get you all guys up to speed here on the news that's come out this morning. So you have the White House says that it will now appeal. That's the latest development on the big news this morning. This U.S. trade court ruling, which came about 4 hours back here, that his global tariff exercise was illegal. So there's an appeal taking place. It's also been obviously trade and the uncertainty around that and what that's created has really been a big topic of conversation here at the UBS Asian Investment Conference. And joining us now, in fact, is the curator of the event, Niall MacLeod, also the head of Asia Pacific Product Management at the bank. What did we talk about?
There's so much to talk about, David. Where do you want to start?
Well, the big topic clearly was trade and the uncertainty that's created. And I'm wondering, are we any closer to certainty? How are people managing what seems to be uncertainty is really having its moment?
But David, there's always, as we know, there's always uncertainty in markets. There's always a topic that people are uncertain about. But I think what's made this much harder is the backwards and forwards, the persistent uncertainty, the political uncertainty that adds a totally different dimension to what investors are normally facing. And it has been the topic of interest for the last 4 months. When we were putting this conference together 9 months ago and you were trying to think about what the key themes are, to be honest, we were a little bit fortunate in a sense that we'd asked Pascal Lamy, the head of the WTO, the former head of the WTO, to come. You're not entirely sure if tariffs are going to be quite so relevant at that point in time, but of course, given what's happened over the last 4 months, that's been incredibly important. And the tariff issue is the number one issue for clients. But you talked about the uncertainty. We have this court ruling, you have political change. The backward and forward, that volatility, I think is really the key issue that investors have been struggling with.
I'm interested to see if you could give us any insights into some of the sessions with corporates, because that's really how the rubber meets the road here, and what they're saying and how they're coping.
Well, look, one of the great things about a conference like this is you've got so many corporates speaking that if you're a fund manager, you're getting terrific data points. We've got 350 companies here. That's just in context. About half of Asia ex-Japan's market cap is here. So if you're an investor and you want to find out issues like tariffs, this is one of the reasons why you come to a conference as big as this. So to your question about what are we hearing, it's an issue for companies in the sense that they too are uncertain. We're not actually getting many data points that companies are seeing that's showing up in revenues. So there's nervousness, as there is with investors. The hard data is showing the same sort of thing, which is elements of slowdown, elements of concern, but we're not seeing consistent weakness yet. But companies are nervous about it. They're more nervous about what they think is coming down the pipe than what they're seeing today. The FX volatility that a lot of this is causing is also a concern for them. And there's some preemptive behavior in terms of cost cutting that they're putting in place just to try and manage through this uncertainty. But we're in a slightly strange position where nothing's really hit yet, but everyone's watching and very nervous of it.
How would you describe, if we could sort of summarize market sentiment, investor sentiment, how would you describe that?
Nervous.
Okay.
I think people are, we've obviously seen the rebound over the last couple of months. Yep. That's made people a little bit more relaxed than they were. Yeah. But there's a nervousness. Where does the cycle go? How much more of a slowdown do we get? What happens with monetary policy? What is the ebb and flow on the politics? Do tariffs come in? Do they not come in? So that nervousness, I think, is really underpinning what's going on. And it's back to this issue of uncertainty. It's always there, but it just seems incredibly heightened compared to what it normally would be.
Is there a consensus on U.S. exceptionalism fading?
To a degree. And one of the interesting statistics of the conference is we were up about 50% from last year in terms of overseas visitors from outside of Asia Pacific, which is probably indicative of the fact that investors are looking at alternatives. And of course, when markets move and the US has underperformed, there's always a bit of backfilling of those stories, just as there was when the US was doing very well. It was easy to describe that about exceptionalism. But certainly when we look at the number of participants from overseas, there's more interest in Asia. And my colleagues in Europe tell me the same thing about Europe as well. So yeah, I think there's certainly a looking for alternatives.
Is there anything we missed? So clearly this has dominated most things, but you guys have put in a terrific program across different tracks. What did we miss? What else stood out to you?
Well, yesterday was all about the macro, largely. So you've had Olivier Blanchard earlier on today. We had some fantastic economics panels. We had a great political panel. Populism is obviously such a key determinant of what's happening on and shaking, or at least shaping the parameters for the economics. Pascal Lamy on tariffs. one of my favorite panels yesterday was with Maria Konnikova talking about uncertainty. How do you deal with it?
Yeah.
You know, she's a world-famous poker player.
Yeah.
Right? So what can you learn? How can you deal with these issues? So that was terrific. Today, the focus shifts a bit towards tech and especially to AI. That theme is just getting more and more important. We've had Microsoft on this morning talking about just the pace of the rollout of all their products, from Copilot right the way through to AI-enabled cloud. So a lot of the panels we've got today are focusing on agentic AI, what it means for companies, what it means for cybersecurity, what it means for robotics, and I'm pretty certain those panels are going to be very full this afternoon, as they were yesterday as well.
Yep. Well, I know where I'm headed after this. Thank you so much for the time, and we look forward to next year. Let's see. Let's see what that. Let's see what the content that holds for us. Niall MacLeod there, of course, curator of the event here, the conference here. Bell, and Bell, tech, you heard that, right? So you know where you're headed right after the shows today. I think I can get you in.
Well, headed right after the shows. I mean, I just feel like I've actually got so much work ahead. The news flow has been absolutely mental this morning, and there's just so much to pass over, not just around trade, but huh?
No, this is work. You cover tech. Come here. I'll take care of the other stuff.
So. Okay. All right. We can catch up on tech, of course, all around the Nvidia numbers today, but also a big focus on the BOK, because we had the decision out earlier. We're getting that presser this morning. Ree just speaking there, the governor right now, talking about the outlook for rate cuts, and they're saying that they're open to more, not exactly sure on the extent of those just yet, but because of the amount of trade uncertainty and discussions between Seoul and Washington as well, not finalised as yet on what the tariffs will look like for Korea, a very export-reliant economy. But the Bank of Korea governor also talking about the currency move, and you're seeing the Korean won just trim some of its earlier losses there. The governor confirming that FX talks between the US and Asia have taken place. He's not opposed to a won-linked stablecoin as well, actually, so talking about stablecoins is there. But talking about the FX impact on inflation, again, he's not too concerned by that. But we have seen the Korean won earlier dropping pretty substantially against the greenback. That was after the BOK cut its key rate to 2.5% as expected, and also signaled that we could have further rate reductions ahead. We'll have plenty more to come. You're watching The China Show, and this is Bloomberg.
The Trump administration has been quite vague about what it actually wants from China. All of the complaints have been very, very high level about the concept of broad unfairness. If you were to try to nail them down, the US complaint has always been the fundamental nature of Chinese state capitalism, the role of the Chinese state in the market, and China is definitely not willing to change a model that it is fond of and feels is working quite well. So, if the US holds to that line, then 90 days, I don't think 900 days would be enough. Time would not be the magical ingredient.
In general, I think the time where the only place to go was the treasury market is no longer there. I think he has broken something which is not going to be repairable.
Yeah, just some of our guests that joined us here on set today, and I think the discussion really there was, the breaking news this morning, the court ruling that tariffs were illegal, the appeal then that followed from the White House, and I think the other sense that we're getting, and I don't want to repeat the uncertainty bit because I think we've really underscored that point that uncertainty is having its moment. The other sense I get, Bell, is people just want to let's get on with it, right? We know this will be at best here for a few months. So let's get on with it. Tech is having a big moment here. There's a lot of conferences taking place, chips, quantum computing, what have you. And markets are doing well in more than several pockets. Equity markets are doing well. And I think the other point we want to make is the offset has been lower rates to some extent, the antidote. And we're getting that exactly as we speak from the BOK.
Yeah, that's right. BOK has been a big focus this morning, I think, as well, just really reflecting a lot of those bigger macro concerns, because there's two key ones that actually feed into the Korean market. Firstly, it's very export reliant, and secondly, it's very sensitive to what the US markets do. Actually, plus it's very exposed to the Nvidia story as well, with SK Hynix, for instance, Samsung, major suppliers into the company. But here you're seeing that feed from the BOK governor talking about what has really also moved the Korean won this morning, trimming its losses after he confirmed that Asian nations had currency talks with the US. But it's sort of at a headline level. Also, the BOK governor saying that they are open to further rate reductions given the amount of tariff uncertainty. And to your point around just layer on layer on layer of uncertainty, that was also the comments made from our Bloomberg intelligence or economics team, saying that this just injects an extra level. But broadly, the markets in the session so far today, we're seeing some upside for Asian equities, not really reflecting the same level of optimism we see in US futures as well, because those are moving high around 1.5%. But taking a look here at some of those chip names, these are the Nvidia suppliers. Again, we had those earnings out, better than expected really, and sort of downplaying that China risk as well. But more ahead, this is the China Show.